for the deadline of 31st of August. Just to clarify at the outset, we're engaged with the unions around the introduction of the new grade, the intermediate grade that would sit between senior lecturer and personal professor, or full professor as I would call it in general terms. But we haven't got agreement on that yet, so it won't be brought in for this August round, okay? We hope to have that in time for next February, if we can get agreement and get authorization from governing authority to introduce it, but there are a few issues still to iron out with the academic unions. So this is the scheme as it has been since its inception and the first deadline of 31st of January 2020. So if we can move on to the next slide, Orla. So the key principles. First of all, promotion is based on achieving recognized standards, and we have tried to benchmark those against other universities, and we've adopted some of the language that is used typically in UCD, but also in some other places around that. But it's achieving recognized standards. It's not like the past promotions rounds in this university, and which still exists in some universities where they cap the numbers that are promoted. You're not competing against each other for a fixed number of places. You're competing, if you like, against the recognized standards, the benchmarks that we've set up. It's based on academic peer review, including external elements. So the promotions panel consists of myself, or rather the role of deputy president and registrar as chair, the vice president, research and innovation, and then 12 professorial level academics from within the university, 8 appointed by the college, or 8 all approved by academic council, but 8 nominated by the colleges, 2 from each college, and 4 nominated by the president. And then there are 2 external members from other institutions, and I'll come back to that shortly. As I say, there's no cap in the number of places. There are regular 6 monthly deadlines, and it's usually 4 p.m. on the last working day of either February or August. So in this case, August, and that'll be the 31st. High levels of performance are expected across each of the 3 core criteria: research, scholarship, teaching, learning, and contribution. And candidates are expected to demonstrate that they're performing at the level to which they have applied for promotion and are likely to continue performing at that level. And we've sometimes used the word trajectory in our discussions around that. And just to clarify, that use of the word trajectory does not mean that we expect you to perform on the basis that you're climbing Mount Everest and you'll continue to climb Mount Everest. It's that you're performing consistently and solidly at the level to which you are seeking promotion, and have the clear and are clearly likely to continue performing at that level. Okay, so we can move on to the second slide. So all academics with a minimum of 3 years service at NUI Galway are eligible to apply to any higher grade, irrespective of current grade. So in past promotion schemes, and it still exists in some places, you must be at a certain level or at the top of whatever scale before you can apply to the next scale. That is not the case here. Theoretically, a lecturer below the bar, if they're meeting if they think they are meeting the criterion, can apply for full professorship, personal professorship. There's nothing in the scheme that prevents that. As I say, the Academic Promotions Committee is gender balanced. It's exactly 50-50 male, female. Yeah, and there's just a message there from Orla. Can you make sure that you're on mute? I see a couple of names there that aren't muted. The Q&A will come at the end of the presentation, okay? The university is committed to equality, diversity, and inclusion in the scheme, and progress is constantly reviewed in this regard. And this includes specific mechanism for recognizing protected leave and adjusting achievements upwards for the purposes of assessment. And that typically, so the most common protected leave is maternity leave, but it can also be carer's leave or whatever. And that the way that mechanism works, and it's one that I think was devised when Anne Scott was here as Vice President of Equality, Diversity, Inclusion. And to give you the easiest possible example in that regard, let's say you've been here for 10 years, you've had 2 periods of maternity leave, which are calculated, whether you took the whole year or not, it's calculated as a year for each maternity leave. And let's say, for the sake of argument, you've got 16 research articles published, okay? So you've been here 10 years, you've been working as an academic for 10 years, might not all have been here, but you've been working as an academic for 10 years. But in fact, you've been working for 8 years. You've got 16 research articles. And therefore, because we give you that's 2 articles per year, and we would give you credit in calculating whether you're meeting the criterion for the equivalent output during the periods of maternity leave. So the 16 articles would in effect then 2 per year, because you've been working as an academic for 10 years, would become 20 articles for the purposes of calculating whether you're meeting that criterion or not. So at its simple, that's a very simple example of how it's done. In fact, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Unit takes the information that you've provided, cross-references it against HR records, follows up if there's any with you if there's any clarification needed, and then gives us the calculation. And I always sit down with the person to go through it to make sure that we're absolutely clear that we've got it right. But that is done by EDI and given to the panel. And then financial considerations play no part in any individual assessment. So if we can move on to the next one, key principles 3. All unsuccessful candidates will receive detailed feedback on the reasons why they were unsuccessful. They must request such meetings in a timely fashion, i.e. within 30 days. I think I'm right in saying that, order, within 30 days of receiving the feedback. All unsuccessful candidates may appeal to the Academic Promotions Appeals Committee, and it is a requirement of the scheme that a candidate must attend for the written and oral feedback in order to be eligible to appeal. Any appeal must be lodged within 30 days of this meeting. The role of the Academic Promotions Appeals Committee is to consider whether or not due process has prevailed in the consideration by the APC of an application for promotion. So it's not a second academic judgment. It is to consider whether due process has prevailed. And they operate independently, and they come and ask us for information. And if they are minded to uphold an appeal, you'll see all the criteria. You'll see it in the documentation that's available online. If they are minded to uphold, then they let us know that and ask us to reconsider and so on. But that process is all outlined in the documentation online. So additional details then, the next slide. So candidates are expected to engage fully with their head of school, both before applying and after the outcome of the process. And I will be emphasizing this point at the briefing session for heads of school that I'll be doing in August. A couple of days after or before, I can't remember which, another briefing for potential candidates. But it really is important that whatever outcome you get, whether it's successful or unsuccessful, you do engage with the head of school. And you know, some people will be delighted with the outcome, some will be disappointed. I think the worst thing you could possibly do is then kind of retreat into yourself and feel that you've got to figure out now that you've got to drop this and stop doing that and do more of this and so on. Heads of school are there for a reason, and if the school is so big that effectively that role has been, for the purposes of line management, has been delegated to a head of discipline, then have the discussion, but have the discussion at the appropriate level. And also seek such advice before you apply. You know, it's really important to get other eyes on your application rather than your own. I think that would help everyone in the process, and certainly in some of the feedback meetings I've been in, it's people have admitted that they perhaps could have made more use of critical eyes on the application in advance of submission. The head of school form, which must be countersigned by the dean, will be submitted by the head of school. The candidate will have a right of reply. And then there are 2 external members with senior academic experience on the Academic Promotions Committee. One is from a STEM background, one is from an arts, business and law background. The STEM, both were senior. One was a dean of science at Queen's, or engineering or medicine, can't remember. Anyway, STEM, a STEM dean at Queen's, and the other was a vice president. Pro-vice chancellor, they're called, across the water in Leeds, one of the universities in Leeds. But she's also one of the leading lights in teaching practice, in third level teaching practice in the UK, and introduced, for example, the National Teaching Fellowships in the UK more than 20 years ago. So we have those, and they are there as process observers. They don't score applications, they simply observe, they comment, they offer opinions, and try to keep us on the straight and narrow. So if we can move on. So following assessment by the panel, by the committee, the APC, and the establishment of a prima facie case, if that is established, external assessors are chosen by the APC from lists provided by the applicants and HO and head of school. This list must be international. Okay, so really we're not benchmarking appropriately if all we're doing is getting the opinions of the people in the universities in this state or indeed this country, just because frankly the interactions are too close and too familiar. So really you need an international list. It can't be just the people that are down the road in Cork and Limerick and Dublin and Belfast or whatever. Promotion will only follow if external assessors clearly agree with the recommendation of the APC. And crucially, because we have on occasion had to go seeking additional assessors. Sometimes it's because the assessors have not got back to us or have declined to do the stuff, but sometimes it's because there's been conflict of interest that I can't help feeling might have been spotted actually. So they should have no conflict of interest. So both the candidate and the head of school should avoid nominating anyone with whom the school or research institute has had recent formal interaction or with whom the candidate has collaborated. Okay. Now, if you collaborated 20 odd years ago, but you've stayed in touch, then that really rules it out. Okay, this should not be any kind of close working relationship. If you've bumped into somebody at a conference once or twice, that's not an issue at all. If somebody has been a recent external examiner in the school, then that's probably compromising the working relationship. This is meant to be an objective, neutral, external assessor. So do think carefully about who you appoint, because it can delay the process. It won't delay your promotion, because if it still goes through, it will be backdated to the same date as everybody else, but it does create a lot of extra work for us, and sometimes it creates extra work for yourself, either as head of school or as applicant, in trying to find other names, because the candidates themselves are asked to report any conflict of interest. And presumably what they report is something you would yourself be aware of, certainly as a candidate. Reapplication is not permitted within 2 years of an unsuccessful application. And just to say that on that particular score, one of the things, and it will be part of the package of agreements, so it won't be in place for this August, but one of the things that we've put on the table to the academic unions is that someone be permitted to fall down on one single criterion, but if the panel considers the application good enough in the round, that they would still be promoted. Until now, and for this forthcoming round, unfortunately you have to meet all of the criteria, but we're proposing that, and we hope to have that in place for next February. Just to say that we have proposed that that would only be for the optional criteria. It would not be for the core essential criteria of research/scholarship, teaching and learning, and contribution. We really couldn't, in all good conscience, say someone is not meeting the criteria in their core teaching, but we're going to promote them anyway. But the optional criteria and their equivalents at the PP level would be the ones that people would be allowed to fail on a single one and still be promoted. But as I say, it's not in place for this August. I hope it'll be in place for February. And then applications via the HR portal. We were developing all sorts of online forms and so on, but frankly, it was a task that foxed us and wasn't amenable to easy amending in the light of the feedback meetings that we've had and the ongoing development of this system. So I think we've simply stuck with the HR portal, and the forms will be available online later this week. Orla, is that right?
So, yes, they'll be available from tomorrow.
Okay, good.
Tomorrow.
Okay, so if we can move on. So the core criteria, and these three would be the criteria you would not be able to fail on and still get promoted, okay? But the optional ones that I'll come to shortly would be. So substantial record of research scholarship appropriate to contract and discipline, and the guidelines that are published online will give you a sense of what's needed there. And the numbers that we're looking for differ depending on whether you're typically writing solo or whether you're writing as part of a team. And then when we look at that, we also look at where it's appropriate to the discipline. at whether someone is first authored or last authored or whatever might be appropriate. And we're aware that in some disciplines it simply is always alphabetical and so on. So it is nuanced, but really you need to show that you've got that substantial record, and it's of high quality, I should say. And that's what it says in the guidelines, high quality research scholarship. So we would make a distinction between a kind of a local journal or supplement to the Connacht Tribune, and at the opposite extreme, without sounding too facetious, Nature, for example. You know, they would not be two equivalent articles in terms of high quality research scholarship. Mindful also of the DORA principles, by the way. They haven't been formally adopted by the VP DORS at the moment. They are negotiating with the various government bodies in terms of how they might be approved. But the broad thrust that we simply do not go by journal citation metrics and so on is accepted, and it has never been the way. We don't simply look at the citation metrics and say, yes, that's grand. There's a whole discussion that takes place around that. And it certainly isn't something as simplistic as the things that the DORA principles object to. Substantial record of teaching, supervising, and mentoring students, and then a substantial contribution to organizational, leadership, or management aspects internally, and or intellectual, cultural, social, or economic life externally at regional, national, or international level, including external engagement activities for and on behalf of the university that are beyond the confines of academic engagement. So just to say that initially when we were developing the scheme, we wanted and had proposed that people have both internal and external, but in the engagement with the unions, and I think it was a fair point and it has worked well. It was recognized that in some areas you might have a greater opportunity for external than internal, and in some areas, because of the numbers, you might simply be required to do more internal and have less opportunity for external and so on. So therefore we amalgamated that box. So there's no requirement that this be equal amounts of internal and external or anything like that. It could, at senior lecturer level, certainly be almost entirely internal with only limited external, or indeed it could be the opposite. I think if you're going up at personal professor level, if you're only professing internally in the university, then you're probably not at professorial level. So you would really want to have that significant external piece at professorial level. Then we have the optional criteria. Next slide, Marla. We have the optional criterion. You choose any five from 10. And again, originally 5 of these on the left are kind of research oriented and the 5 on the right are teaching oriented. And we were going to have 2 tracks in the end. We amalgamated them in, and these are 5 optional criteria for you to choose which 5 suit you best. Okay. External research leadership, and we've amended the form slightly to expand the box for comments there, and I've put a slightly different headline, just making it clear. Whatever you're putting in external research leadership, be clear about what the leadership element is. Don't tell us simply, I'm on a committee. Don't tell us simply, I peer review. Tell us what the leadership element is. Okay. And in fact, peer review is possibly more relevant to international standing than leadership per se, unless of course you're chairing a peer review panel, and then you spell that out. Okay. But be absolutely clear what the leadership element is, and there's a box there that, and all these boxes are expandable. Where there's a word limit, there's a word limit. Where there isn't a word limit, the box is expandable. And tell us what you need to tell us in order that it's clear to the panel what it is you're claiming against the criterion. And when it says external research leadership, be clear what the leadership element is that you're claiming against each of the things. Recruitment and supervision to completion of doctoral students and or supervision of postdoctoral researchers, plural, and other PGR activity is contextual. So just to be clear about that box, I've actually split the box up now for the latest iteration of the forms, and Orla and I were just working on that earlier this week. So that there's one box for your PhD students and one box for the postdoctoral researchers, and then the third box is for your other PGR and presumably postdoctoral research activity if you want. But there are a lot of things that, of course, can go in different boxes. But just to be clear, the criterion states, and it varies from discipline to discipline. Some disciplines, PhD students and postdocs can be harder to come by than in others. But in any case, given that this is an optional criterion at this level, you should have at least 2 substantial completions stroke supervisions. Okay, So the postdoctoral, for that to be substantial, you'd want it to be more than just say 6 months of postdoctoral or a year of postdoctoral supervision. It needs to be broadly analogous to a PhD completion. And there's a space in the box for you to outline what are the achievements that demonstrate the success there. With a PhD student, it's clear, the PhD graduates, the student graduates. With a postdoctoral, you need to outline the things that you did together or the things that were facilitated for this postdoctoral researcher, or what it is that constitutes the success of that supervision. And there's a box there that clearly asks you for that. And just to say that the other PGR activity, that is contextual. So that would be, for example, in disciplines where, we might be having a discussion, well, yeah, is that really meeting where we would expect someone to be for SL level in terms of postgrad supervision in this discipline where, postgrads and postdocs might be 10 a penny. And then we'd be saying, okay, well, look, maybe it's a bit borderline, but you know what, they've done all this other PGR activity. So yes, that's fine. Okay. But it is not a substitute for the minimum, which is 2. No matter which discipline you're in, okay? And then other disciplines 2 won't get you because, as I say, and that is part of the whole tailoring to the different disciplines, disciplinary expectations, okay? Research funding, I think that speaks for itself. Again, we look at that and we look at the consistent performance. So in some disciplines, you would expect to have a high level of research funding performance. 7-figure sums would be the norm. Certainly as a total over a number of years. In others, it might barely be hitting 6 figures because, we all know the research environment in this jurisdiction, certainly since 2008, the thrust has been very heavily towards applied STEM for the lion's share of the funding. And it's been harder to come by in pure research areas or in some of the humanities and social sciences. And there we'd be looking for, well, even if it's only small grants, are you consistently getting those small grants? Is there a trajectory? Is there a consistent level of performance such that gives us comfort that you will continue to perform at that level? And if that's the case, then a figure that would not get you next nor near meeting this criterion in a discipline that regularly gives out 6- and 7-figure grants would actually be no problem at all in another discipline where the funding is rarer. Impact of research beyond academia, and it's really important, and there are various definitions of impact of research that are online, and Molly, I think, sent us some links to those, but this is not about your H index. Okay, the impact of the research beyond academia is not about your H index. It's not about the conferences you organized. That can conceivably be under international standing. It can be under external research leadership. It can be under, if you're organizing some big international conference on behalf of an external body. It might happen here in Galway, might happen virtually. But the point is, it can be seen as external research leadership if that is some big international external piece. But impact of research beyond academia is that engagement with wider society, how your research is translating into policy documents or economic impact or industrial impact or whatever it may be, or social or cultural engagement, whatever. Okay, so just be clear about that. That's not H index or the fact that you've got all these academic collaborations the world over. They belong elsewhere. And then international standing, I mean, that can be vastly different measures of esteem, invitations to be on various prestige boards, peer review boards, grant awarding reviews, the most prestigious conference in your discipline, where it's speakers by invitation only, or keynote speakers at things that most people would have a sense of what international standing might be, and the guidelines give you some examples. Okay, maintaining theoretical currency in teaching, and I've put theoretical currency in bold there because that is really showing that whatever the pedagogic theories are that relate to your teaching, that you're showing that you're actually up to date with those. So you'll be citing literature, and if you choose that box, and showing how you've engaged that. Innovation in teaching, and that isn't necessarily just introducing new courses. It's also doing new innovative things in the teaching itself. And you need to be clear about that. And be careful what you call new, because it might be new in Galway, it might have been done 20 or 30 years ago elsewhere. So that will not have the same impression, make the same impression as you saying, I've done this new, and by the way, very few people have done it, or I've done this for the first time anywhere in maths, say, you know, or I've taken a methodology that typically belongs over there and in the humanities disciplines, and I've found aspects of it and adapted them, and they've been very, very new in the discipline that I'm in. So think about what the innovation means there, but it doesn't just mean the introduction of new courses. Although if you've done new, God knows, interdisciplinary courses or done the new courses in a new configuration or way, that could be innovation. But the simple introducing of new courses is not per se meeting the criterion of innovation in teaching. National standing in teaching, that could be being part of various working groups, advisory bodies, et cetera, et cetera. Impact in teaching and learning, that's where you would demonstrate, and unlike impact of research beyond academia, impact in teaching and learning is typically things that you have done in teaching have been adopted by others, internal and external, usually, okay? And then pedagogic funding, that doesn't have to be pedagogic research funding. It might be that you've got pedagogic funding for the setting up of new courses, etc., and that all falls within that remit. Just to say that, so those are the 10 broad criteria. There will always be things that will fit into different boxes, but you do need to be very careful of duplication and be clear that even if you're referencing the same thing in 2 different boxes, or sorry, aspects of this, it's different aspects of it. And the easiest and clear-cut example I always give is this. A PhD student who completes can appear twice in this form. First of all, as a completion of a doctoral student. But secondly, if they got an award, we have, you know, a funding, an IRC, let's say it's an IRC PhD scholarship, we attribute the funding to the supervisor here. So that will be research funding for you, but that's because you got the research funding in the first place. The funding itself doesn't make the completion. So the completion is then an achievement 3 years later. So they might be both linked to the same scholarship and so on, but it's clearly 2 very different things. Getting the scholarship in the first place as research income and getting the student through 4 years later so that they have a PhD. So that's legitimate, but be careful that you don't simply say, you know, under leadership, I was chair of the editorial board of such and such a journal, and then international standing, you say, I was a member of the board of the same board, because by definition, if you're chair, you're a member. That would be seen as duplication. Okay, so be careful about that. Things can sometimes go in different places, but just make sure that if something related is going in 2 different boxes, that it is 2 very different aspects of that. It's 2 different achievements fundamentally that may be linked, but they are distinct. Can we move on to the next one then? So then at personal professor level, the core criteria for all applicants is the organizational leadership management skills which you contributed to the academic unit, and then exceptional and sustained contribution to intellectual, cultural, social, or economic life externally to the university. So really, in terms of the contribution, if you want to be a personal professor, then you need to show that you're not only pulling your weight internally, but you're also making an impact externally with your contribution to the intellectual, cultural, social, economic life. Okay, we'll move on. Then we have the other criteria are, and you will see echoes of what we've just seen for SL here, except it takes up to the next level. So the first 5 of these are effectively the 5 that were on the research side of the slide about SL. So research outputs, research leadership, sustained recruitment and supervision to completion. Sorry, 2 to 6 are. 2 to 6 are the equivalent. The research leadership, the supervision of postgrads and postdocs, research funding, evidence of exceptional impact, and internationally excellent standing. And just to say that, so it's exceptional and internationally excellent that are required there. And this is in the research scholarship track. But we also require people not to be then, to use that old pejorative term, Mayfainers if you want to be a personal professor. So you're still expected to be doing what was said in the previous slide, the contribution, but you're also expected to have an outstanding, so that's recognized, not exceptional, but outstanding contribution, slightly lower, to teaching, supervision, and mentoring of students at most or all levels in the school. So it's not that you can get the SL and then say, I'm going on the research track and I don't care about the students anymore. You've got to make sure that you're still contributing there. And then in terms of the research outputs, obviously that's a core one. And if you're going on the research track, we expect the record of research outputs to be exceptional. Okay, so that's the research and scholarship track. In addition to the 2 core on contribution, it's those 7. As I say, 1 and 7 are the kind of, if you like, core ones of research outputs and teaching, and then 2 to 6 are the equivalent SL ones on the research side of the house. And if we move on to the next slide, teaching and learning, 1 and 7 are core teaching and research, but here it's the teaching that is to be exceptional and the research at a slightly lower level outstanding. Okay, because frankly, if you're, and we have looked at this and we looked at how it's done in other universities, and when we benchmark the teaching and learning track for personal professor, it showed that anyone who's a personal professor in a teaching and learning track doesn't get it just for being a good teacher. They're out there professing. They are actually publishing. Very often it's pedagogic research, pedagogic publications, and so on. And that would be expected at a professorial level. And we've already, by the way, in the first 3 rounds, appointed 2 people to personal professor on the teaching and learning track. So that is very much in play, and one that I think has been a success so far. And then criterion 2 to 6 are analogous to the teaching and learning criteria that were at the SL level, where the overarching, by the way, going back to the SL, the overarching level of achievement that's expected there is substantial. That's the adjective we've used. And each criteria is measured against that notion of, well, what really constitutes substantial? And the panel has discussed that, and some of it we discussed around the houses in round 1 and round 2 and so on. We've had 3 rounds so far. And we've had a success rate in the promotions of something in the high 50% of the 80 applicants that we've had so far. So it seems to be working, not for everyone, but it's working for most. But it's substantial at SL level. It is exceptional then at PP. But bearing in mind that it's there are different tracks, it's exceptional in the core elements and the main elements of whatever track you choose. And then just below that, outstanding for the element that would be less core to that track, if I can put it that way. And then moving on to the PP leadership. So, and these are the additional criteria. And the first 3 of those are around that leadership. We want external leadership at university level, proven exceptional leadership at national, international level, outstanding external impact at international. Then, as with the other tracks, we also require the person in the leadership role to continue to teach and to have a high level of research, but that's not exceptional, that's outstanding. And then any of the criteria under the PP research or T&L track that are not already in the list, so 2 more. So there are 9 criteria there in total as well. Okay, then moving on. Professional conduct. So just to say that the members of the APC and the APAC are bound to absolute confidentiality in respect of all deliberations of the committees, subject only to the fact that the documents are FOIable after the process. Under no circumstances should candidates approach or seek to influence members of the APC or APAC on any matter relating to their application or its scheme. That applies to heads of school and deans as well. And heads of school and deans are required to respect and maintain the confidentiality of all individual applications. And it's accepted that in some of the very large schools, a head of school might reasonably, and in the interests of the candidate, delegate that duty to the head of discipline, who would be in a much better position, for example, to come up with potential external assessors and also with an analysis of how the individual is performing. And we accept that, and we're not going to be ideological about that and say that a head of a very large school who might be at one remove from the candidate's performance has to do this. They do have to sign off on it, but they will reasonably consult the head of discipline in the process. Moving on then, deadlines. So those are the next deadline. Every time we get to the next round, I take the deadline at the top off and I put a new one on at the bottom. So those are the deadlines. And for the next few years, at least, it is in fact the last day of the month, because the last day of the month doesn't fall on a weekend. So it'll always be the last working day. And then finally, all information relating to the scheme is available at that site. Oh, that's come up in green on green, but maybe before we put this up online, we could maybe change the color in those 3 links, Orla. Anyway, it's NUI-Galway/academic promotions. And then the queries can be addressed to that email, but we compile responses, and there's an FAQ page. And then a link to the HR application system is included in the academic promotions homepage, and it effectively functions like job applications. There are 5 jobs listed up there, but of course there aren't just 5 appointments. It has worked well for us so far. As I said earlier, we were trying to develop online forms, but there were certain complications there that just made that frustrating, if I can put it that way. So I think that's all I've got to say. If we can unshare the screen, then we can move to the Q&A, and hopefully I can see more faces than I can see at present.